Listener. Today, we're diving into a somber but absolutely crucial piece of history, the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. Now, let's set the stage right out of the gate. We're not just going to rattle off a list of dates and battles here. What we're really doing is taking a focused look at the mechanics of power. We're examining a truly tragic sequence of events that completely reshaped the globe, cost millions of lives, and honestly altered the course of humanity forever.
It brings us to a pretty chilling question. How exactly does a modern democracy willingly surrender to a dictatorship? We usually picture freedom being taken by brute force, right? Stolen in the middle of the night by some invading army. But history shows us a reality that is far more terrifying. Sometimes, freedom is just handed over. It gets voted away by a desperate population that's desperately looking for easy answers to incredibly complex problems. So keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this, because what we're really looking at is a case study in how systematically a democracy can be dismantled from the inside out.
Section 1. A Shattered Nation. Okay, picture 1918. The guns of World War I have finally fallen silent, but peace didn't bring relief to Germany. It brought a collapsed empire and a totally shattered economy. Millions of exhausted soldiers were coming home, and they weren't met with parades. They were met with crushing poverty and this agonizing sense of national humiliation. And the root of all this despair? The Treaty of Versailles. The victorious Allied powers imposed some seriously devastating punishments. Germany lost a massive chunk of its territory, its military power was stripped right down, and they were forced to pay these absolutely enormous, unpayable financial reparations. Millions of everyday citizens firmly believed their own leaders had completely betrayed them. So you have this fierce anger filling the streets of cities like Berlin and Munich, and in that climate of extreme resentment, the stage was perfectly set for a dangerous ideology to take root.
Section 2. A Dangerous New Voice. Out of this really chaotic, angry post-war environment, a dangerous new figure emerges. Born in Austria in 1889, Adolf Hitler was a failed artist and a deeply embittered World War I veteran. He eventually found his way into this tiny, fringe extremist political group, which would very quickly transform into the infamous Nazi Party. And here's the thing, at first almost nobody took him seriously. The political establishment just viewed him as a radical fringe figure. But Hitler had a terrifying political weapon. He had an extraordinary ability to manipulate growing crowds. His speeches weren't about logical debate, they were incredibly aggressive, emotional, and packed with grand promises of restoring the empire to its former glory. He gave people easy scapegoats, relentlessly blaming Germany's massive suffering on the democratic government, on communists, and, most virulently, on Jewish people.
But his strategy had to evolve, and that evolution was incredibly dangerous. Back in 1923, Hitler actually tried to take power by violent force. It was an event known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It completely failed and landed him straight in prison. But that failure sparked a terrifying realization for him. He realized an armed rebellion just wasn't going to cut it. If he truly wanted to control Germany, he was going to have to use the democratic system against itself. He basically figured out that he could exploit the structural vulnerabilities of the young republic to take power entirely legally, from within the very government he wanted to destroy.
And the wildest part is, he didn't even try to hide his intentions. While he was in prison serving time for treason, he literally wrote a book about it, called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. The whole playbook was right there in black and white. He outlined his extreme nationalism, his horrific belief in racial superiority, deeply aggressive anti-Semitism, and a very clear dream of expanding Germany's territory through pure conquest. The complete blueprint for his terrifying intentions was out there for everyone to read, but the world entirely failed to recognize the imminent danger of his words.
This is basically the ultimate boiling frog effect in action. He failed in 1923, sure, but then 1929 happens and the Great Depression strikes. Global banks collapse, businesses go under, and millions of Germans are suddenly unemployed overnight. The entire nation is plunged right back into desperate poverty. And as history shows us, desperate people will often follow strong, loud voices. The Nazi Party leveraged this total economic terror to promise order and jobs. By 1933, using the actual legal framework of the Republic, Adolf Hitler was officially appointed Chancellor of Germany.
Section 3. The Death of Democracy.
The moment Hitler became chancellor, any illusion that he was going to play by democratic rules just vanished. German freedoms were dismantled, and we're not talking over a period of years here, but in mere months. He exploited constitutional emergency powers to bypass parliament completely. Step 1, political opponents simply started disappearing.
Step 2, freedom of speech was completely wiped out. By Step 3, the Nazis took absolute control of the media and the education system, twisting things so heavily that children were actually being indoctrinated to worship Hitler from a very young age. And Step 4, they weaponized the fear of the citizens. People were actively encouraged to report their own neighbors, friends, and even family members to the state for any perceived hint of disloyalty.
Now, to enforce this kind of total erasure of freedom, the regime deployed absolute terror. Organizations like the SS and the secret police, known as the Gestapo, became the blunt instruments of the state. They crushed any remaining opposition with just brutal force. When you pair those enforcement groups with a relentless 24/7 machine of state-sponsored propaganda, they essentially blanketed the entire nation in a thick, suffocating layer of fear. Absolute paranoia became a daily reality for every single citizen.
Section 4. Terror and the Holocaust. And the tragic reality is that the political oppression was really just the beginning. What followed was a dark descent into an unprecedented human atrocity that still shocks the conscience of the world today. That hateful rhetoric Hitler laid out years earlier in Mein Kampf, it was put into terrifying, industrialized action. Jewish families all across Europe were systematically stripped of their most basic human rights. They were forced from their homes, crammed into starving ghettos, and then deported in packed trains to concentration and extermination camps. The Nazi state actually turned its vast modern resources toward the calculated, systematic murder of human beings.
The sheer scope of the victims targeted by this hatred is staggering to even think about. 6 million Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust, but the hate did not stop there. The regime also targeted and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Romani people, disabled individuals, prisoners of war, and political opponents. This was an industrialized slaughter that permanently cemented this era as one of the absolute greatest atrocities in human history.
Section 5. The World at War. While this unbelievable internal nightmare was unfolding, Hitler started looking outward. In September 1939, driven by his self-proclaimed mandate to expand German territory, he ordered the full-scale invasion of Poland. This aggressive move officially ignited the devastating global conflict of World War II. Those early years of the war were totally defined by Blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war. These were rapid, deeply overwhelming military tactics. We're talking fast-moving tanks, highly coordinated infantry, and completely devastating air support. Using Blitzkrieg, Germany rapidly conquered huge swaths of Europe. Poland fell, France fell. As bombs destroyed cities across the continent, there was a terrifying moment in history where Hitler's war machine appeared completely unstoppable.
But as is often the case, extreme hubris leads to fatal miscalculations, and the tide dramatically turned. In 1941, Hitler made arguably his biggest strategic mistake, invading the massive Soviet Union. His forces hit a brutal Russian winter. Their resources completely vanished, and military casualties absolutely exploded. That exact same year, the United States officially joined the Allies after the attack on Pearl Harbor. By 1944, following massively pivotal battles like Stalingrad in the east and the Normandy invasion in the west, Germany found itself surrounded by enemies from literally every single direction. At that point, a complete military collapse became inevitable.
Section 6. Collapse and Legacy. Fast forward to April 1945. The supposed 1,000-year Reich that Hitler promised had barely lasted a single decade, and it was now sitting in absolute, burning ruins. Allied forces were sweeping all the way across Europe, and Soviet troops were directly marching onto the streets of Berlin itself. And the end of the dictator wasn't some grand, glorious final battle. It was just a quiet, cowardly retreat. On April 30th, hiding deep inside a fortified underground bunker, listening to the artillery fire of Soviet troops right above his head, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. And just days after his death, Nazi Germany officially and unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was finally over. 70 million. More than 70 million people were dead worldwide as a direct result of this massive conflict and the Holocaust. Entire global cities lay in rubble and ash. That staggering, honestly incomprehensible number represents the ultimate, devastating cost of this horrific era.
We're going to finish our explainer today with this thought. The world had just witnessed firsthand exactly how propaganda, deep-seated hatred, and blind nationalism could lead humanity straight off a cliff into catastrophe. Hitler's rise stands as a permanent, glaring reminder of how powerful fear and manipulation can become when democracy collapses. So I want you to consider this.
If a democratic society can so rapidly be weaponized against its own people, what exactly must we do today to ensure our own institutions never fall to those same dark temptations? Thanks so much for watching.